Okay, I'm Peter Orton from Valley Sea Kayaks. What I'm going to do is talk you through the three models that make up our contemporary range of sea kayaks. I'm going to demonstrate on these rotor molded kayaks. The reason for doing that is on composite kayaks with different colours of deck and hull and seam line, it sort of detracts from the overall shape and form of the kayak. And on the rotor molded kayaks, because they're slightly satin finished as well, you don't get as much reflection. It's a little bit easier for me to show you those differences. We are fortunate at Valley because we make all our core range of kayaks in both rotor molded and composite, so we're sort of uniquely positioned to be able to demonstrate it like this. And what I'm going to do is just go through the three models, Genesis, Serona, Attain, talk about a particular design feature like length or cross-sectional area or rocker and how it varies across the three. So I'm going to start that by talking about the kayak length and the length of the different kayaks and how that affects how they paddle, and just work my way through those different aspects. And at the end I will do a little summary of each of the three boats. Okay, the first thing I'd like to talk about is the sea kayak's length, because often we refer to the kayaks by their size. So we have a Genesis 1410, here we have a Serona 1510, and we have an Attain 17.5. So we often designate the kayaks by length. And also very often we'll get a customer come to us asking for, I really need a 17-foot kayak, or I really need a 16-foot kayak, or I think I need a 16-foot kayak. And often, especially when we're talking about longer kayaks like the 17-foot plus kayaks like the Attain, it's because they're worried about the kayak speed, and because everyone's got this thing that, you know, the longer kayaks are quicker. And yes, it's true, all of the things being equal, a longer kayak will be quicker, but there are some caveats to that. Speed is a factor of two things when it comes to kayaks. You've got the form factor, the length, the width, and that's basically how the shape passes through the water and how early it'll try and climb its own bow wave. But the other factor is you've got a skin friction, how much drag is there between the surface of the kayak and the water surrounding it. And actually the longer kayaks and the bigger displacement kayaks, because they have more surface area, they have a higher skin friction, a higher friction with the water. And often with a less powerful or less experienced paddler, often the smaller paddlers as well, they don't get to the point of overcoming enough of the skin friction. That holds them back to the point where they don't get to the limit of the form factor, the amount of how much benefit they get from the extra length of the kayak. And a good story of this is we do a kayak called the Rapier, and we do it in a 20-foot version, a racing sea kayak. And we sold one of these to a relatively small build female paddler, relatively experienced, but you know, a little bit older, so probably, you know, so wasn't the most powerful or athletic of paddlers. And she actually came back to us and said she was actually quicker in her Romany 16. And it's probably true. You know, the fact was she couldn't generate enough power to get to a speed through the skin friction to get to the point where the form factor was an advantage. So just bear that in mind when you're choosing a kayak, that we're not talking a coracle or a short wide water boat. We're talking, even at 14'10", you're still talking a relatively quick touring kayak that will be more than capable of keeping up in a mixed group of paddlers amongst people with 16 and 17-foot kayaks. It's only when you come to be carrying more load, because that is a factor as well, a longer kayak will carry the load better, and your type of paddling is probably more A to B or more open crossings, so having a straighter tracking kayak that's easier in a following sea, and those are the benefits come into play with the longer kayaks. But if that isn't your type of paddling, you're probably very likely will get just as much speed and possibly more enjoyment out of one of the shorter kayaks. So, you know, it is really a consideration that don't immediately think, because I'm doing more experienced paddling and I'm paddling with a more experienced group, I need a longer kayak. Okay, Now this is a really good angle to talk about the rocker and the end profile of the kayaks. If we start off with the Attain, we can see it's a very sleek bow. There's a reasonable amount of rocker, but it's very, very progressive, very fine entry to the kayak. And that's back to this wanting a good expedition kayak to be really good, point A to point B, very efficient. You want it to just gently lift over the waves, you know, as little fuss and as little effort as possible. So you want it to sort of gently ride up and either over or through, depending on the size of the wave. You don't want it being pitched wildly backwards and forwards. And if you had much more volume at the bow, or a much blunter bow, you'd tend to have that pitching around. In contrast, the Genesis, we can see it's a much more aggressive bow angle. There's more volume towards the bow. Now, partly that is a function of its length. Being only 14'10", we're trying to keep as much waterline length as possible to keep a good hull speed. But also, with a boat like the Genesis, you're more likely to find yourself playing near the shoreline, surf, rock gardens, rock hopping, and so you're more likely to be on sort of the steeper, shorter waves. And what the important thing in there is, you don't want a kayak that's going to purl. As you come in on a steep wave, you don't want the bow to dive down. You want the volume and the rocker so you can carve out of trouble. So that's really why something like the Genesis and the shorter boats tend to have more volume, a little bit blunter and a little bit more rocker. Now we've seen like the Serona, the 16-foot boats are a real sweet spot for instructors and guides, and also the fact that you're wanting a kayak that can do the longer trips but also play in the surf. So you're combining the best elements or both, or trying to combine the best elements. So you have a good amount of rocker, reasonable amount of volume, and so what you end up with is a kayak that is still comfortable paddling A to B through the chop, you know, riding the following seas, but also really, really playful in the surf and rock gardens. And for something like an instructor or guide, you also want that maneuverability, so you can move around the group, if they get into trouble, you can get to where they are. You can also demonstrate different techniques, and that's where the 16-foot kayaks are a really good compromise between the sort of full expedition style boats and the more playful, shorter kayaks. Okay, we've turned the kayaks over, and I'm hoping with it being quite a bright day, we'll be able to talk about and be able to show you some of the details about the cross-sectional profile of the kayaks and how we alter that to get the design characteristics across our range. So again, I'm going to start with the Genesis. It's got quite what we call a shallow V hull, so not much angle on the two flatter surfaces. It also goes through a soft area of chine, what we call the edge of the kayak, the chine, the rail, and then into a distinctive hard edge, hard chine or rail. And that is actually quite low on the kayak when you turn it up the other way. You can see the distance there is actually quite deep. And what that means is, when coupled with the shallow V, we get firstly very good initial stability. So if a less experienced paddler gets in the kayak, or someone who's not particularly confident, it's quite reassuring. The kayak's not feeling as if it's going to tip over on them. But also, with the rail being quite deep in the water, it responds very quickly to any edging, any leaning. So you can very quickly get confident carving or edging the kayak to get the kayak to go where you'd like it to go. So it makes it a very playful kayak, but very forgiving and very, very confidence-inspiring kayak. How that differs with something like the Attain, which is designed for generally for more experienced paddlers who are going to be more expedition type. When we say expedition type, I mean more open crossings, more likely to be away from the shore, so experiencing a following sea or a beam sea, and with a more moderate, slightly steeper V'd hull and soft chines, you do lose some of that initial stability, and you do lose some of that real crisp responding to edging. But what you do gain is the kayak is not unsettled by the waves as much. So if you imagine, if you're paddling, you're right out, you know, from shore, you've got waves coming in from the side. The last thing you want is the kayak to forever being pitched over, because you're ever having to correct it. With a kayak with slightly less initial stability and slightly softer chines, it's much easier for you to compensate. So you can lean into the waves much more easily. The waves aren't trying to tip you. And so when you're engaging in those sort of longer open crossings and more, we're saying, as I've said before, that sort of A to B type paddling, it's less draining, less fatiguing, or you can concentrate on paddling forward, getting to where you want to get to. I've said it a few times already, but the Sirona is incorporating kind of elements of both, really, because it's wants to be a very versatile kayak. 16 foot, I've said it already, is a great length of kayak for guides and instructors. And so yes, you want it to be comfortable on those open crossings, but you want it to be playful when you're demonstrating in surf, or you're trying to get around the group. So you can still see that slight rail, but it's much softer into it, and the rail is slightly further up on the kayak. And well, really all that means is you've got to be a little bit more confident and a little bit more committed to your edging. You can still engage, you can still get to do what you want to do, but you're going to have to be much more positive in your paddling to do it. So probably a slightly more experienced paddler, or more confident paddler, certainly. Okay, let's try and summarize that. I know there's quite a lot of information in there. So Genesis, our shortest kayak, our most stable and most initial stability, responds most to edging, so really good for less experienced paddlers, because they'll have that confidence, they'll get the feel of the edging the boat really quickly and learn those skills as well. But it makes a great surfing kayak or rock garden, rock hopping kayak for the more experienced paddler. The Attain is all about efficiency, all about carrying a load if necessary, getting over distance, especially in open water where you might be subjected to more of a beam sea or following seas. So slightly less initial stability, but easier to keep on track and keep yourself upright and focused on going forward and getting where you want to go. The Sirona, as we've said multiple times, is combining elements of both. A confident, committed paddler can surf it very nearly as well as something like the Genesis, but equally with the slightly less initial stability and the rail slightly higher and softer, it's still really comfortable as an open water expeditioning style kayak. But in 16 foot just makes a fantastic kayak for instructors, guides, anyone who does a vast range of that type of paddling. So that's a brief summary. If you want more information, you can come to our website or phone us directly, email us directly, talk to one of our dealers. You know, all these models are available in composite, carbon Kevlar, and our extreme carbon construction. And yeah, just come and ask us and we'll talk to you.